What happens when a Texas rancher comes home, only to have police show up because his neighbor swears he doesn't belong, only for everyone to find out he's the man who oversees every HOA in America. Lawrence Duvall didn't expect trouble that Friday afternoon. He had just flown back from Phoenix, where he'd been in meetings for 3 days, and all he wanted was to check on his ranch before settling in for the weekend. The late Texas sun stretched long across the land, painting the pasture in warm amber, the kind of view that usually quieted his thoughts. But this time, peace didn't last more than a few minutes. He parked his silver Ford truck at the gate, stepped out, and unlocked it with the same key his father had once used. The land had been in his family for over half a century, a piece of history passed down through sweat and hard work. Every wooden fence post had a story. Every trail cut through the pasture carried a memory. But the neighborhood around it was different now. Over the last decade, developers had carved up parcels of the surrounding land, building neat homes and manicured lawns that rubbed shoulders with the ranch. A gated subdivision had sprung up around the very edges of his family's property. And with it, new neighbors, people who barely looked at him, let alone greeted him. That didn't bother Lawrence much. He'd spent years running boardrooms and handling conflicts that would rattle most folks. Neighbors keeping their distance wasn't worth losing sleep over. But that afternoon, as he swung the gate open and drove through, one pair of eyes followed him closely. From across the cul-de-sac, a woman paused mid-step with her dog. She was in her early 60s, her sharp bob cut and pressed khakis giving off the air of someone who thought rules were her second language. Janice Kettering. She stared as Lawrence's truck disappeared behind the gate. Her lips tightened. Her grip on the leash stiffened. And then, with a huff, she pulled her phone out. Inside the truck, Lawrence rolled down his window to take in the familiar smell of hay and cedar. He smiled faintly, thinking of how his father used to say, "This land doesn't just feed cattle, it feeds the soul." Lawrence had repeated that line many times to friends who didn't quite understand why he stayed rooted here despite his national responsibilities. He wasn't just the owner of this ranch. He was the newly appointed executive director overseeing homeowner associations nationwide, a man who dealt with power struggles and community disputes every single day. What he didn't know yet was that his neighbor was about to mistake him for an intruder. On the other side of the fence, Janice pressed the phone against her cheek. "Yes, this is Janice Kettering. I'm reporting a suspicious vehicle. A man just drove onto the ranch at the end of Willow Point Drive. I don't think he belongs there." She lowered her voice and added, "He doesn't look like the type who owns land here." The dispatcher asked for details. Janice's voice sharpened as she described his truck, his jacket, even his posture. She didn't know his name, his history, or the fact that he had signed the subdivision's HOA approval paperwork years earlier. All she knew was what she assumed. Meanwhile, Lawrence parked beside the barn. He stretched his arms, listening to the familiar creak of the wood as he opened the old barn door. Dust floated in the slanting sunlight, the air heavy with the scent of leather and hay. He pulled off his jacket, hung it on a nail, and started checking on the stalls. 2 horses nudged their heads over the rails, and he patted their foreheads, whispering greetings like he always did. The phone in his pocket buzzed with an email notification, but he ignored it. For the first time that week, he wasn't thinking about board meetings, bylaws, or complaints from across the country. He was home, or at least he thought he was. Because while Lawrence checked on the feed bins, Janice's voice carried across the phone line once more. "Yes, please send someone quickly. This doesn't feel right at all." Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars rolled slowly down the street. Their lights flickered in the fading daylight, bouncing off the subdivision's pristine windows. Children riding scooters stopped to stare. Curtains shifted in living rooms. The scene was being set, not just for an ordinary welfare check, but for something that would leave everyone in that subdivision rethinking the way they judged the man at the gate. But the real tension wouldn't begin until those flashing lights spilled across Lawrence's land. The officers had already been briefed by dispatch before they reached the ranch. The call they received was vague, but heavy with implication. "Suspicious man on private property, possible trespasser." It was the kind of description that, in practice, could mean just about anything. But in neighborhoods like this, vague suspicions carried weight. Inside her living room, Janice Kettering stayed glued to the window, her phone still in hand. She had already called her husband to let him know she was handling a situation. He told her not to get involved, but Janice had never been the type to stand back when she felt something needed addressing. To her, rules were the backbone of civilized living. And in her mind, this man driving an older Ford truck through the gated entry wasn't following the rules. She muttered to herself as she watched the patrol cars ease up to the gate. "I knew it. No one like that belongs here. Not with trucks like that. Not with— Well, you can just tell." Her dog tilted its head, confused by the rising tension in her voice. Out on the property, Lawrence leaned against the barn wall, taking a moment to catch his breath. He had just finished checking the locks and water troughs when the faint reflection of red and blue lights caught his eye. He frowned. Stepping out into the open, his first thought wasn't trouble. Sometimes emergency vehicles drove through to cut across to the service road. But when he noticed both cars slowing right at his gate, a knot formed in his chest. He reached for his phone instinctively, but stopped. He had nothing to hide. This was his land, his home. His name had been on the deed longer than most of the subdivision had even existed. One officer, a younger man with a buzz cut, spoke into his radio before opening the door. The other, older and broader in frame, scanned the property with the kind of practiced caution that suggested he expected resistance. They didn't storm the property, but the presence of 2 patrol cars at the gate was already enough to draw attention. Neighbors began drifting out onto porches. Phones appeared in hands. Conversations dropped to whispers. And in the middle of it all, Janice positioned herself at the end of her driveway like a self-appointed witness. The younger officer approached first. "Sir," he called out, voice steady but commanding. "Mind telling us what you're doing on this property?" Lawrence blinked, caught off guard. "What I'm doing? This is my land. I just got back today. Is there a problem?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We got a call from a neighbor saying someone might be trespassing. Just doing our job, sir. Can we see some ID?" Before Lawrence could answer, Janice raised her voice from across the fence. "Officers, I told you. I've lived here 15 years. I've never seen this man once. He doesn't belong here." Her words carried across the quiet street, sharp and unrelenting. The officers didn't turn to silence her. But the weight of her accusation pressed in. Lawrence straightened his shoulders. He wasn't going to raise his voice, not yet. But he wasn't going to shrink either. "Look," he said evenly, pulling his wallet from his back pocket. "My name's Lawrence Duval. Been the owner of this ranch since my father passed. You can check county records if you like. I've got my driver's license and ownership documents right here." He held out the ID, calm but firm. The older officer stepped forward to examine it, his expression unreadable. He took his time, as if weighing more than just the plastic card in his hand. Janice scoffed loudly, folding her arms. "Papers can be faked. You can't just take someone's word for it." That stung more than she realized. Lawrence clenched his jaw, his eyes steady on the woman. "Ma'am, you don't know me. You don't know my family. But you're willing to stand there and say I don't belong on land that's been ours for 50 years? Tell me, what exactly do you think someone who belongs looks like?" For the first time, Janice faltered. Her mouth opened, then shut, her rehearsed confidence slipping. The officers, too, seemed to pause. The younger one shifted awkwardly, lowering his radio slightly. Lawrence didn't press the silence further. He didn't need to. The words had landed where they needed to. Still, the tension hung in the air like a rope pulled too tight, waiting to snap. But if Janice thought the matter would end with a simple ID check, she was about to learn the situation was far bigger than she imagined. The gravel crunched under the weight of the patrol cars as both officers eased further onto the property. The younger one, Officer Bradley, kept his hand near his holster, not drawing it, but resting there in a way that suggested he wasn't fully sure what he'd find. The older officer, Sergeant Holt, carried himself with slower, steadier movements. His eyes didn't leave Lawrence. Lawrence stood tall, his boots planted firmly in the dirt. He wasn't about to show nerves. Still, there was a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes when you realize you're suddenly the center of a story you didn't start. "Mr. Duval, right?" Sergeant Holt finally said, holding up the license. "We need to clear something up. Dispatch told us a resident here reported suspicious activity, said you may not belong on this land. You understand why we had to come check." Lawrence's eyes flicked past the officer to Janice, who still lingered at the fence line like she was waiting for applause. "Suspicious activity," Lawrence repeated slowly. "That's what we're calling me unlocking my own gate and feeding my horses?" The sergeant didn't answer right away. The younger officer shifted, his stance more rigid now. "Sir, we don't make the calls. We just respond. All we need is confirmation that this property is yours." "You've already got it in your hands," Lawrence replied, nodding toward the license. "That address matches the deed. This barn, that pasture, every acre is mine. My father worked this land until the day he passed. I carried it after him. What more do you need?" Janice's voice sliced through the exchange. "Officers, don't be fooled. Anyone can say they own land. I've never seen this man once in 15 years. Do you mean to tell me someone owns acres of prime property and just disappears? Doesn't add up." Lawrence exhaled sharply, disbelief flashing across his face. "Disappear? Lady, I travel. I work across the country. That doesn't erase 50 years of family ownership." He turned back to the officers. "You see what this is, don't you? She didn't call you because someone broke in. She called because I came back." The younger officer's jaw tightened. The sergeant, however, studied Lawrence with a look that suggested he understood more than he let on. Still, procedure was procedure. "Do you have proof of ownership on you, sir? Paperwork? Deed? Tax bill? Anything like that?" Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "You mean, aside from the fact that my name is on the county's official database? You want me to carry property records every time I walk into my own barn?" His voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. The officers said nothing. The silence stretched too long, broken only when Janice piped up again. "See? He doesn't have it. He's bluffing." Lawrence turned his full attention to her then, stepping closer to the fence. His voice was calm, steady, and aimed directly at her. "Bluffing? You think a man in his 50s, standing on the land he's tended since he was a boy, is bluffing about who he is? Tell me, Mrs. Kettering, what kind of neighbor decides a person doesn't belong before even knowing their name?" Her mouth opened to fire back, but for once words didn't come so easily. The crowd of neighbors gathering behind her didn't help either. A few had their phones raised, recording. Others whispered, torn between siding with Janice's certainty and the unease of realizing they might be watching a mistake play out in real time. Sergeant Holt finally broke the silence. "Mr. Duvall, I'm not saying you need to carry documents everywhere you go, but for the sake of clearing this call, if you've got anything, utility bill, property record, something with your name tied to this address, we can put this to bed right now." Lawrence sighed, pulling his truck keys from his pocket. "Fine. Give me a minute." He walked toward the cab of his truck, every eye following him, the barn door creaking shut behind him. Inside the truck, he reached into the glove compartment where he kept a folder of documents for situations just like this. Insurance papers, tax statements, ranch supply invoices. He didn't keep them there out of paranoia. He kept them because experience had taught him moments like this weren't rare. He stepped back toward the officers, holding out the folder. His movements were deliberate, his gaze never leaving theirs. "Here, every bit of proof you'll ever need. Though I shouldn't have to provide this just to stand on my own land." Sergeant Holt flipped through the papers slowly, nodding. The younger officer leaned over to glance, his posture softening slightly. The truth was in black and white, stamped and signed by the county itself. Lawrence crossed his arms, his voice steady but sharper now. "So, officers, are we done here? Or do I need to keep proving myself while my neighbor insults me in front of the entire subdivision?" The sergeant closed the folder, his eyes lifting to meet Lawrence's. There was no mistaking it now. The man standing before them belonged here. But Janice wasn't ready to let the matter die, and her next words would push the entire encounter to a breaking point. Janice's face was turning red. Her jaw worked as if she were chewing over words she knew wouldn't land well but felt too self-righteous to hold back. The moment Sergeant Holt handed the documents back to Lawrence, she barked out, "Papers can be doctored. I don't care what he shows you. This doesn't feel right. No one in this community has ever seen him before. Why now?" Lawrence pivoted toward her slowly, his boots pressing into the dirt with a measured patience. He didn't raise his voice, but each word cut through the air sharp enough to stop a few whispers among the neighbors. Why now? Because I travel. Because my work takes me out of state for days at a time. And because I don't feel the need to knock on your door to validate my existence every time I come home. The younger officer, Bradley, cleared his throat. Mrs. Kettering, the documentation checks out. His name, the address, tax records all match. He has every right to be here. Janice didn't budge. Well, I want to know what kind of work keeps a man gone so long that his neighbors don't know him. He says he owns this ranch, fine. But who really knows? What's he hiding? Lawrence's eyes narrowed. He wasn't angry yet, but the weight of years of moments like this pressed behind his stare. You want to know what I do? He asked evenly. I manage homeowner associations across the country. Every single rule you've ever complained about, every covenant you've cited, I oversee them. When people say they don't like HOAs, I'm the one they're really talking about. Surprised to find out your neighbor is the man who signs off on the very bylaws you live under. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A few neighbors exchanged glances, suddenly aware this wasn't just some landowner. Lawrence wasn't exaggerating. His name carried authority in the world of homeowner associations, a world Janice thought she ruled with her clipboard and stern voice at every local meeting. Janice blinked, stunned for a moment, but quickly recovered. You expect us to believe that? If you were really in charge, you'd have introduced yourself at the HOA meetings. People with that kind of authority don't stay invisible. Lawrence gave a humorless laugh. Invisible? That's what you call it? Or is it easier for you to assume someone doesn't belong rather than ask who they are? I didn't attend the meetings because this is my home, not my stage. I don't owe anyone in this subdivision a performance to justify my name on that deed. The silence that followed was heavy. Even Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Janice looked less confident, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. Officers, she pressed, you should run his ID anyway. Make sure he doesn't have priors. If he's telling the truth, then it shouldn't matter. If he's hiding something— Lawrence cut her off, his voice still calm but edged with steel. Now you want to dig into my record? You think because you don't recognize the man who owns the ranch, he must be a criminal? Tell me, Mrs. Kettering, do you make every stranger who moves into this subdivision hand over their entire life story? Or just the ones you think don't look the part? The neighbors murmured. A man from across the street whispered something to his wife, and she shook her head, tugging him back toward their door. Others stayed, their phones still up, capturing every moment. Sergeant Holt finally spoke, his tone steady but pointed. That's enough, Mrs. Kettering. We've confirmed Mr. Duval's ownership. There's no cause to continue pressing. The call was for suspected trespassing, not to put his life under a microscope. Janice's face twisted with disbelief. So you're just going to let him waltz around with no accountability? That's how rules get broken. Lawrence looked at her, then at the officers, then back at the neighbors watching in silence. Rules don't get broken because someone came home to their own land. Rules break when people weaponize them to keep others out. And let me remind you, I know more about rules than anyone standing here tonight. The crowd reacted again, this time with less shock and more recognition. Some nodded faintly, realizing how badly Janice's accusations were backfiring. Sergeant Holt handed Lawrence back the folder of documents. Mr. Duval, we appreciate your patience. From what I see here, you're clear. There's no legal issue. Lawrence took the folder, his voice lower now but steady. There never was a legal issue. The issue was a neighbor who decided her suspicion mattered more than my ownership. For the first time since the confrontation began, Janice stepped back, her dog tugging at the leash as if it sensed the tension better than she did. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. Because instead of letting the truth settle, Janice was about to push further, desperate to protect her pride, and that choice would only make the fallout worse. Janice's stubbornness was like a wall nobody could climb. Even as Sergeant Holt tried to wrap things up, she stepped forward, yanking her dog back when it resisted. Her voice carried across the yard, clear enough for every neighbor lingering nearby to hear. This isn't about me being unreasonable, she snapped. This is about protecting our neighborhood. We've worked hard to keep standards here. And now someone waltzes in after years away, claiming ownership and expects us to just accept it? No, that's not how it works. Lawrence closed the folder of documents in his hand and rested it against his side. He had learned in boardrooms and public hearings that sometimes silence had more power than words. He let her talk. He let her dig her own trench deeper with every sentence. The younger officer, Bradley, shifted on his feet, visibly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Kettering, like the sergeant said, this matter is closed. His paperwork is legitimate. He's not trespassing. We can't treat him like a suspect just because you don't like the way things look." Janice's head whipped toward him, indignant. "Excuse me? I'm the one who called. I'm the one who took responsibility when no one else would. And now you're dismissing me." Her tone was so sharp that a few neighbors visibly cringed. One man muttered under his breath, "She's digging a hole she can't climb out of." Lawrence finally spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Mrs. Kettering, let me ask you something. When was the last time you walked this property? The last time you cared for the pasture, or checked on the barn, or fed the horses inside it?" She blinked at him, caught off guard. "That's not my responsibility." "Exactly," Lawrence said, stepping forward. "It's mine. Always has been. And yet, you stand here trying to strip me of something you never built, never maintained, never owned. What gives you the right to demand I prove myself on land that's carried my family's name for half a century?" The crowd shifted again. The murmurs were no longer against Lawrence. They were turning on Janice. Some neighbors crossed their arms, their faces hard with disapproval. Others whispered openly about how far she was taking things. Sergeant Holt raised a hand. "All right, let's de-escalate. Mrs. Kettering, you filed a report, we investigated, and we found no crime. That's where this ends." But Janice wasn't ready to stop. She jabbed a finger toward Lawrence. "If you really are who you say you are, then prove it. Tell us why we've never seen you. Tell us where you've been. Tell us why you think you can just stroll back into this community like you're above the rest of us." Lawrence's shoulders straightened. The sergeant sighed under his breath, but Lawrence spoke before anyone could cut him off. "You want to know where I've been?" he said, his voice louder now, carrying across the subdivision. "I've been in Phoenix, in Dallas, in Sacramento, handling meetings and disputes you couldn't imagine. While you've been complaining about paint colors and lawn heights, I've been making decisions for thousands of communities across this country. I don't just live under HOA rules. I write them. I don't just attend meetings. I lead the national organization that governs them." The silence that followed was electric. Phones recording in the crowd zoomed in. The weight of his words sank in like heavy rain. Janice's mouth opened, but for the first time, nothing came out. She looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to back her up. But the crowd had shifted. A few neighbors even nodded at Lawrence, whispers carrying fragments like, "He's serious. He really is in charge." And, "She picked the wrong fight." Sergeant Holt raised his eyebrows, surprised. "You're the director?" Lawrence nodded once. "Executive director. Every HOA in the country reports up through my office. Every policy, every dispute, every complaint about weeds or mailboxes, I oversee it. So before you accuse me of not belonging, maybe consider that you've been living under rules I approved long before you ever dialed 911 tonight." The younger officer let out a low whistle under his breath. "That's something," Janice, red-faced, tried to recover. Well, even if that's true, you should have made yourself known. That's just common courtesy." Lawrence gave a dry laugh. "Courtesy? You called armed officers on me without even asking my name. You want courtesy, Mrs. Kettering? Courtesy starts with respect, and respect is the one thing you didn't show me tonight." The crowd reacted again, louder this time. Some neighbors lowered their phones, shaking their heads at Janice. The balance of the confrontation had shifted entirely. Sergeant Holt straightened his stance. "Mrs. Kettering, we've heard enough. You made your call, but this matter is closed. Mr. Duval has proven ownership beyond question. We're not dragging this any further." For the first time, Janice's face betrayed something new. Not just anger, but embarrassment. Her dog tugged at the leash again, and she yanked it back with more force than necessary. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her authority crumbling under the weight of her own choices. Lawrence turned toward the officers. "Are we done here?" Holt nodded. "We're done." But while the officers were satisfied, the neighbors weren't finished processing what they'd just witnessed, and the fallout was about to spill into the entire community. The crowd along Willow Point Drive wasn't dispersing the way it usually did after a call like this. Normally, when patrol cars left, people went back inside, muttering about, "What a mess," or "better safe than sorry," but not tonight. The neighbors lingered, caught between fascination and discomfort. Phones were still pointed, recording what was left of the standoff. Lawrence stood near the barn, the papers still in his hand, while Janice shifted nervously at the curb. Her shoulders hunched, her jaw clenched, but her eyes darted from one neighbor to the next, searching for someone to back her up. She found none. A woman from 3 houses down, tall with silver hair pulled into a bun, finally broke the silence. "Janice," she called across the road, "maybe you ought to leave it alone. He's right, this land's been Duval property longer than any of us have lived here." Janice snapped back. "How would you know? You don't have proof either." The woman shook her head. "I've lived in this county for 30 years. Everybody knows the Duval ranch. Your fight's with your own assumptions, not with him." That simple statement hung in the air heavier than the flashing lights that had just shut off. Neighbors whispered louder now, the balance of the moment shifting further toward Lawrence. Officer Bradley leaned toward his sergeant, voice low but audible. "You realize this is all on video, right? If this goes online, it's going to be ugly." Holt gave a weary nod. "Yeah, ugly for her, not for him." Lawrence finally turned to face the small crowd. He wasn't trying to grandstand, but something in him knew this was bigger than a private dispute now. The humiliation Janice had tried to pin on him had flipped back in her direction, and people were watching. "You all want the truth?" he said, raising his voice just enough to carry across the fence line. "Here it is. My name is Lawrence Duval. This land has been in my family for over 50 years. My father worked this soil until his hands were calloused and his back was bent. When he passed, it came to me. I've been away because my job takes me across the country. I'm not hiding. I'm not trespassing. I'm living on what's mine." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Nobody moved. Even Janice stayed frozen, her eyes wide, as if she'd never expected him to speak so openly. "And since Mrs. Kettering brought it up," he continued, "let me make something else clear. I'm not just any property owner. I'm the executive director of the National Homeowners Association Board. Every HOA across the United States answers up the chain I oversee. That means the same rules Mrs. Kettering throws around in this neighborhood? They're approved by my office. So if she thought she could shame me tonight, all she's done is embarrass herself in front of her neighbors and the very system she claims to defend." A ripple of reaction spread through the crowd. Someone whistled softly. A man chuckled under his breath. Another whispered, "That explains a lot." Janice's cheeks flushed crimson. "That doesn't excuse—" she began, but Lawrence cut her off, his tone firm but not cruel. "No, it doesn't excuse you. You made a call to the police because you assumed I didn't belong. Not because you saw me breaking in, not because you saw me stealing, just because I didn't look familiar to you. That assumption could have gone a lot worse if things had played out differently. Think about that the next time you feel entitled to decide who does and doesn't belong." The silence that followed was so heavy, even the evening cicadas seemed to fade. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were judging. And this time, their judgment wasn't aimed at Lawrence. Sergeant Holt shifted his weight, clearly ready to put the situation to rest. "Mr. Duval," he said respectfully, "everything checks out. We'll file the report as cleared. Sorry for the disruption." Lawrence gave a small nod. "I appreciate that, but don't apologize to me. Save it for the next person who has to prove themselves on their own land." Bradley looked down, shame flickering across his young face. Holt gave a slow nod of agreement. Janice, though, couldn't stand the silence anymore. She blurted, Well, I was just being cautious. Somebody has to look out for this neighborhood." Lawrence's reply came like a steady hammer hitting steel. "Looking out for your neighborhood is one thing. Targeting people you don't recognize is another. There's a line, and you crossed it. The only person who needed protection tonight was me. From your accusations." The woman with the silver bun stepped forward from the crowd. "He's right, Janice. You owe him an apology." Janice stiffened, her lips pressed tight. She didn't say it. She couldn't. Pride locked the words in her throat. She tugged her dog and muttered something under her breath as she stepped back toward her porch. Neighbors parted slightly as she passed, no longer rallying behind her, but watching her retreat with quiet disapproval. Lawrence watched her go, then turned back toward the barn. His voice was lower now, directed more toward himself than anyone else. All this for coming home, but the night wasn't over, because the neighbors who had witnessed everything weren't about to let the incident fade quietly into memory. As the officers began heading back toward their patrol cars, the energy in the neighborhood didn't settle. It thickened. People weren't going inside. They weren't ready to close their blinds and pretend they hadn't seen what just happened. They wanted answers, maybe even a confrontation. But this time, not aimed at Lawrence. A couple from across the street, Robert and Melinda Hayes, were among the first to step closer. Robert, a man in his late 50s with a baseball cap tugged low, spoke carefully. "Mr. Duval, Lawrence, I'll be honest, I didn't know you were the one who owned this ranch. I just knew it was part of the old Duval land. My father used to talk about how your family raised cattle out here back in the day." Lawrence nodded once, his tone even. "That's right. My father started it when he came back from Vietnam. Kept it running through droughts, floods, and just about everything else. I've done my best to keep it going." Melinda, arms crossed, glanced toward Janice's porch. "I think most of us owe you an apology. Maybe not with the words she used, but with silence. We saw you drive through that gate plenty of times before and just never said anything. Some folks whispered. Nobody stepped forward to introduce themselves. That's on us." Lawrence tilted his head, acknowledging the honesty. "I don't need apologies. I just need neighbors who treat me like I belong here. Because I do. I don't care about handshakes or barbecues, but I do care about respect." From a few feet away, Janice bristled. She stood stiffly at the edge of her porch, arms folded across her chest. Her dog tugged against the leash again, restless with the tension. Every word exchanged was another reminder that the spotlight wasn't on Lawrence anymore. It was on her. A younger neighbor, Chris Alvarez, raised his voice from the back of the crowd. "She calls the cops every other month. I swear, half the time it's someone walking their dog too close to her yard or kids playing basketball past sundown. But tonight? Tonight was different. You don't call cops on a man at his own ranch." The murmur spread. Neighbors who had never spoken openly against Janice before were starting to. Their loyalty to her rule-keeper persona was fading. Lawrence didn't gloat. He simply leaned back against his truck, arms folded now. "She's not the only one. Lots of people around the country are quick to pick up a phone when they could just start with a question. 'Hey, sir, do you live here?' That's all it would have taken. But suspicion was easier." Janice's voice finally cracked through the whispers. "Don't make me the villain here. I was protecting my community." This time it wasn't Lawrence who answered her. It was Robert Hayes. He pulled off his cap, ran a hand through his graying hair, and said bluntly, "Protecting your community doesn't mean humiliating someone. You embarrassed all of us tonight, Janice. Not him. Us. Because the truth is, you didn't protect anything. You just exposed your own bias." The silver-haired woman from earlier chimed in, her voice louder than before. "And let's be honest. If it had been someone you knew, you never would have called. This wasn't about safety. It was about judgment." The words stung more than any accusation Lawrence could have made himself. Janice's face went pale beneath the porch light. Her lips parted as if she had a rebuttal ready, but nothing came out. The officers, now standing by their cars, watched with quiet interest. Sergeant Holt muttered under his breath to Bradley, "Community's policing itself now. They don't need us." Bradley smirked. "About time." Lawrence looked at the crowd again, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of the moment. "I'm not here to make enemies. I've got enough of those in my line of work. I came back to tend to my ranch, just like I've always done. You all don't have to like me, but I won't tolerate being treated like a stranger on my own land. That ends tonight." The group was silent, not because they disagreed, but because his words rang with something undeniable. For many, it was the first time they'd heard him speak beyond a passing hello, and it was the first time they realized how wrong it had been to ignore him all these years. Janice, sensing the crowd wasn't going to defend her, tugged her dog toward the door. But before stepping inside, she turned sharply, voice shaking with frustration. "Don't think this changes everything. Respect isn't earned in one night." Lawrence didn't miss a beat. "You're right," he replied. "Respect is earned over years, which is why you should have realized my family already earned it long before you moved here." Her door slammed shut, the sound echoing across the subdivision like the closing act of a scene nobody wanted to watch, but everybody needed to. Neighbors lingered, trading looks, murmuring under their breath. For the first time, it wasn't Lawrence they were whispering about, it was Janice. But while the neighbors had plenty to say among themselves, the officers weren't leaving just yet. They had their own words for Lawrence once the crowd thinned out. By the time most of the neighbors had slipped back into their homes, the air outside had cooled, but the tension still clung like humidity. Porch lights flickered on, doors shut, curtains were tugged closed. Only a handful of people lingered in quiet clusters, still whispering about what they had just witnessed. Lawrence leaned against the side of his truck, his arms folded, watching the officers pack up. Sergeant Holt closed his notebook, giving one last glance toward Janice's porch where the blinds had just snapped shut. Then he walked back over, his boots heavy against the gravel. Officer Bradley trailed behind him, a little slower, like he wasn't sure if he should speak at all. "Mr. Duval," Holt began, his voice lower now that the crowd was gone. "I want to say this directly. You handled yourself better than most folks would have. Cooler head than I've seen in situations like this." Lawrence gave a short nod. "I've had practice. When you spend years sitting in HOA meetings, listening to people argue over mailbox colors, you learn patience. This wasn't my first time being accused of not belonging, just the latest." Bradley winced, shifting on his heels. "Look, I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm sorry for how it played out. We're trained to respond to calls fast, but that doesn't excuse treating you like you were guilty from the start." Lawrence studied the young officer. His apology seemed genuine, his eyes darting between the ground and Lawrence's face, nervous but honest. "You're young," Lawrence said finally. "You've still got time to learn. Just remember what happened here before you put weight on the next vague call. Ask yourself, am I responding to a crime, or am I responding to someone's assumptions? There's a difference." Bradley nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. You're right." Sergeant Holt crossed his arms. He was older, worn by decades of late-night calls and disputes that never made headlines. "I've been doing this 30 years. I can tell when a caller's fear comes from something real, and when it comes from prejudice they don't want to name. Didn't take me long to see which one this was. But we still have to show up, you know? Can't just ignore a call." "I understand that," Lawrence replied, his voice measured. "What I don't understand is why I'm the one who has to prove myself on land my family has worked for generations. That part will never sit right." The sergeant sighed. "It shouldn't happen, but it does. And it will again, unless more people start calling it out like you did tonight. You weren't just defending yourself. You made that whole crowd think. Even my rookie here." Bradley glanced down, a little embarrassed, but smiled faintly. "He's not wrong. I'll be thinking about this one a long time." Lawrence shifted, running a hand across the folder still tucked under his arm. "What you saw tonight is what I deal with in boardrooms, on calls, in hearings. People who think rules are weapons to use against others. I spend my career reminding them rules are supposed to build communities, not tear them apart. Tonight wasn't different, just more personal." For a long moment, the three men stood quietly, the cicadas finally filling the silence the crowd had left behind. Holt finally broke it. "You don't owe me your time, but I'd like to come by again sometime. Off duty. Not as a cop, just as a neighbor. I'd like to hear more about your father's ranch. Seems like the kind of history worth knowing." Lawrence's expression softened slightly. "History only matters if people are willing to listen. You're welcome to come by. Maybe you'll understand why I don't take kindly to someone trying to write me out of my own story." Holt gave a respectful nod, then turned back toward the patrol cars. Bradley lingered a moment longer, then added quietly, "Mr. Duval, for what it's worth, I think you taught this whole street more in an hour than half the HOA meetings ever could. Lawrence chuckled lightly at that, shaking his head. Funny thing, officer. Most people hate HOA meetings. But tonight, everyone got one they'll remember. Bradley smiled faintly, gave a small wave, and followed his sergeant back to the car. The engines started, headlights sweeping across the dirt drive, before fading as they turned back toward the subdivision. Lawrence stood there alone again, the barn looming quiet behind him. The horses shifted softly in their stalls. He exhaled long, the tension finally draining from his shoulders. He'd handled the storm, but he knew this wasn't the end of it. Neighbors talk, stories spread, and by morning, his name would be on every tongue inside that gated community. But while the officers had left satisfied, the subdivision itself wasn't ready to move on, and the reckoning among neighbors was only just beginning. The following evening, the subdivision's clubhouse, usually reserved for birthday parties and HOA gatherings, was filled with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Word had spread quickly. Videos from the night before had already made their way across group chats, and everyone had an opinion. Some were embarrassed, others were angry, and a few were simply curious to see if Janice would show her face. She did. Janice sat in the front row with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, lips pressed into a thin line. The same air of authority she usually carried was cracked now, but she refused to show weakness. In her mind, the neighborhood had misjudged her. She was determined to remind them why she was always the loudest voice at HOA meetings. Lawrence wasn't planning to attend. After all, he hadn't been invited. But as the noise carried across the street, and a couple of neighbors personally stopped by his ranch to say, "You should be there," he realized avoiding it would only give Janice the stage again. So he walked into the room 20 minutes late, boots still dusty from working the barn, and the chatter dimmed the moment he appeared. All eyes shifted. Some neighbors looked relieved. Others leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. Janice's face tightened. The HOA president, an older man named Walter Klein, cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I think we all know why we're here. There was an incident last night that has stirred up this community more than anything in recent memory. Before this room breaks into finger-pointing, I'd like to give both sides a chance to speak." Janice was on her feet before he finished. "I don't need to explain myself," she declared, her voice louder than necessary. "I did what any responsible neighbor would do. I saw someone I didn't recognize on private land, and I called the police. That's it. That's my job as a resident who cares about safety." Several neighbors groaned quietly. A woman near the back muttered, "That's not what happened." Walter tried to calm the room. "Janice, thank you. Mr. Duval, would you like to respond?" Lawrence didn't move right away. He looked around the room, scanning the faces, before finally stepping forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not here to argue with Mrs. Kettering," he began, his tone steady. "What happened last night speaks for itself. I drove through the gate of my own ranch. Within minutes, police were on my property. And why? Because a neighbor decided I didn't look like I belonged. That's not safety. That's suspicion. And there's a big difference." Murmurs rippled across the room. Someone whispered, "He's right," while another neighbor shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Lawrence continued, "I showed proof. I showed respect. But that wasn't enough. Because the truth is, some people will never be satisfied until you prove yourself again and again, no matter how many times your name's already on the deed. That's not protecting a community. That's tearing one apart." Janice shot up again, unable to stay silent. "You're twisting this. If you'd bothered to attend a single HOA meeting, if you'd made yourself known, this wouldn't have happened. You hid from us." Lawrence's eyes fixed on her. "I didn't hide. I worked. I traveled. I provided for my family and kept this ranch alive. My responsibility isn't to satisfy your curiosity. It's to maintain what my father built. And whether you like it or not, I'm also the person who oversees every HOA in this country. The very system you claim to defend answers to me. You think I don't understand community? Community is my life's work. But community only works when people lead with respect, not suspicion." The room erupted. Some neighbors clapped softly, others raised their voices in agreement. Robert Hayes stood up. He's right. We've all let Janice run these meetings like she's the sheriff of the subdivision. Last night showed us how far it's gone. That wasn't about rules, that was about pride. Janice's face flushed. You're all turning against me because of one mistake, Walter Klein finally interjected, raising his hands. Enough. This isn't about tearing each other down, it's about learning. What happened last night reflects poorly on all of us, not just Janice. We should have known Mr. Duval better. We should have made the effort. That's what community means. Silence followed his words. Even Janice couldn't immediately argue back. Lawrence glanced around the room, then said quietly, I don't need apologies. I don't need sympathy. I need neighbors who recognize that respect isn't something you give selectively. If you're willing to give it to one person, you owe it to everyone. For once, nobody disagreed. Heads nodded. Conversations hushed. Janice sank slowly back into her chair, her authority slipping further with every passing second. But the true weight of the night wasn't just in Janice's humiliation, it was in the lesson that spread across that room, one that would stick with the entire neighborhood long after the meeting ended. When the meeting wrapped up, people lingered in the clubhouse longer than usual. Some walked over to Lawrence, offering handshakes and quiet words that carried more sincerity than small talk ever could. A few admitted they'd been guilty of ignoring him for years, letting Janice's voice drown out their own silence. Others simply said, "Glad you're here," before heading home. Janice slipped out quickly, her dog tugging her toward the exit, but the sting of the night clung to her like a shadow. She didn't say another word, didn't dare look Lawrence in the eye. Pride kept her back stiff, but her retreat was enough proof that the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her. Lawrence didn't celebrate. He didn't feel victorious. What happened hadn't been a win. It was a reminder, a heavy one, that prejudice rarely announces itself with honesty. It hides in suspicion, in whispers, in assumptions dressed up as concern for the community. And until people called it out, it would keep surfacing, over and over. Later that evening, Lawrence walked the length of his ranch. The night was still. The barn lights glowed faintly. The horses shifted softly in their stalls. The land stretched out under a quiet sky, just as it had when his father worked it years ago. He paused by the gate, the same one Janice had watched him pass through with suspicion the day before. He leaned against the fence and let the weight of the day settle. The officer's words replayed in his mind, the neighbor's murmurs, the silence that followed his own. All of it swirled together into one truth he couldn't ignore. Respect. That was what it boiled down to. Not rules, not titles, not paperwork. Respect. It cost nothing, but its absence could cost someone everything. His phone buzzed with a new email, another HOA matter waiting for him miles away in a different state. But he let it sit. Tonight wasn't about policies or disputes. Tonight was about something bigger. He thought about what he might tell the people who would eventually watch the videos captured by neighbors' phones. The ones already spreading online. The ones that would no doubt spark debates far beyond Willow Point Drive. He imagined himself saying, "Before you judge who belongs, ask yourself why you think you get to decide. Before you assume the worst, ask a name, a question, anything but suspicion. Because one false call can change someone's night, or their life." The cicadas droned on. The land breathed with him. And he felt the steady pulse of belonging that no neighbor, no phone call, no police cruiser could erase. As he finally turned back toward the house, Lawrence knew the story wasn't over. People would keep talking. Some would defend Janice, others would condemn her. But what mattered wasn't the gossip. It was the lesson. Because in the end, communities don't survive on rules alone. They survive on trust, on kindness, on respect that runs deeper than paperwork and appearances. That's what his father had taught him, and that's what he hoped his neighbors had finally learned. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone in that subdivision saw a face they didn't recognize, they'd start with a question instead of a call. So if you've followed this story to the end, let it stay with you. Think about the assumptions you carry, the snap judgments you might make. And the next time you're tempted to decide someone doesn't belong, stop, ask, respect. Because respect doesn't just change neighborhoods, it changes lives. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, stories that remind us of the weight of respect and the cost of forgetting it.